And welcome to the mother of all Oddity Archive history lessons. So big that I'm gonna have to launch yet another occasionally recurring sub-series just to get through it all. I've been covering the history of home video on this show for several years now, but I think it's getting to be time to tackle the big one. You know what I'm talking about. Video Home System, or VHS. And I've still got other formats to cover, but let's at least get this one started. So today I want to tackle those early years where home video, just in general, was still more of a geek thing as opposed to an everyday appliance, if you will. So today we're going to cover from the inception of what became VHS circa 1971 up through the rise of the video rental club right around the end of the decade. Yeah, grab your polyester and bell bottoms, kids. In October of 1969, Sony unveiled the prototype for a new video cassette, as opposed to open-reel videotape. The following year, Sony and JVC, the latter then parented by Matsushita, with minor input from 3M, Ampex, and a few others, joined forces to standardize the video cassette. Sony and JVC, the Japanese companies, especially took an interest, as technicians and even the Japanese government were calling for a standardized video format, in every sense of the word. The result was the 3/4-inch U-matic format, released in the fall of 1971. Problem was, while certainly more manageable than professional 1 and 2-inch tape, it was still very large, very expensive, was incapable of being easily hooked up to most consumer TVs, and was incapable of holding more than, at the time at least, 1 hour of material. Worse yet, Sony owned much of the design of the VCRs themselves.
This videotape demonstration has been recorded on the Sony Color video cassette and is being played by the Sony Color video cassette system.
Frustrated by U-matic's inaccessibility, not to mention Sony's relative grip on the technology, by the end of 1971, JVC engineers Shizo Takano and Yuma Shiraishi laid out what was known as the Video Development Matrix, which was a list of 12 requirements for a consumer-grade video cassette and VCR. Those were, number 1, it had to be compatible with any consumer-grade TV. Number 2, picture quality had to be reasonably close to off-air quality. Number 3, it needed a minimum 2-hour recording capacity. Number 4, tapes must be interchangeable between machines, unlike, say, the Sony CV series. Number 5, it needed to be versatile enough to record off-air and be able to be used in tandem with a video camera. Number 6, players and tapes should be affordable enough to appeal to regular consumers. Number 7, the VCRs needed to be user-friendly. Number 8, the VCRs need to have low maintenance costs. Number 9, the technology must be capable of mass manufacture. Number 10, parts must be interchangeable. Number 11, decks must be easily serviceable. And number 12, being able to recognize the potential social and political implications of such democratic technology. Bear in mind, the Information Society concept had been launched in 1962, and its, if you will, manifesto had more recently found its way to Japan. Almost as soon as Takano and Shiraishi started work on their new format, the brass at JVC got cold feet about taking another crack at a new video format so soon, and shelved the project. However, despite major departmental budget cuts and a reduced team of engineers, Takano and Shiraishi soldiered on with their project after hours. Over the course of 1973, the pair cranked out 4 prototypes of their new video home system, the last arriving just in time for a visit from the head of Matsushita, Mr. Matsushita himself. Matsushita liked what he saw and resumed funding for the project. This is especially noteworthy as A, at the time, Matsushita was considering backing Sony's still experimental Betamax format. B, like with U-matic, the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry was pressuring manufacturers into settling on one consumer video format, this time Betamax. And C, VHS was to be an open standard. In other words, effectively anyone could manufacture it. Having said that, there were still bugs to be worked out with VHS, which held off its introduction until 1976.
Oh, and you've missed your football on TV.
Anything for you, Mum.
Oh, you are a good boy.
Bye.
When you have a Philips television recorder, you don't have to miss anything.
Starting back in 1972, other companies had been rush releasing their own stabs at a consumer-grade video cassette format. Over in Europe, Philips had already released their VCR, video cassette recording, format. In the US, Avco, in tandem with Sears department stores, had released Cartravision. Both of these formats relied on chunky, stacked reel cassettes, and thanks to the tension issues of such things, were prone to failure. Cartravision fared especially poorly, as it could only be purchased in tandem with a new TV, recorded in poor skip field quality, read it recorded only every third frame of video, and cost almost as much as a new economy car at the time.
Cartridge television, you can record programs even when you're not at home, or when you're sleeping. It has a timer you can set to catch shows as far ahead as 8 hours.
In 1974, BASF, or BASF, announced a consumer longitudinal video recorder, LVR, whose tape ran along a stationary as opposed to rotating head, though this format was never released. That same year, Sanyo introduced their V-Chord format, which looked like an 8-track on steroids. In 1975, Panasonic, Matsushita, preempted its own forthcoming format with the Philips VCR-esque VX format, aka the Quasar Great Time Machine. And speaking of Philips, around the same time, they started work on their eventual Europe-only V2000 format. And for the coup de grace, Sony got their Betamax format out the door in May of 1975 in Japan, November of 75 in the US. Though, even that was a bit rushed. The first, and for a while, only Betamax model, like Cartravision before it, was only available as part of a full TV console. Sony got their first standalone Betamax, the SL7200, out the door in February of 1976, which was effectively just the VCR proper extracted from the console unit.
Only by the limits of your imagination.
On September 9, 1976, JVC Brass unveiled the Video Home System, or VHS, at the Hotel Akura in Tokyo. As a side note, I should mention that Video Home System has always been what VHS stands for, and not vertical helical scan. VHS wasn't strictly vertical, and the helical scan patent belonged to Ampex. Sorry, internet pedants. But I digress. The first VHS VCR, the JVC HR3300, went on sale on October 31st, only in the Akihabara Station area of Tokyo. Depending on your source, the HR3300 may have found its way to the US as early as January of 1977, but given that it was given an unveiling at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago in early June, it was probably that summer when it was released. In August, RCA unveiled their first VHS unit, this one with a long play option, allowing for up to 4 hours of potential recording time. These went on sale in October and were the first RCA video product released to use the Selectavision name. And while I can't find anything concrete, it appears that VHS didn't find its way to Europe until at least early 1978.
Easily to the antenna terminals of any television set, whether it be black and white or color. And you can do it all by yourself.
Before I begin, a little disclaimer. During the 1977 to 80 time period, the history of VHS and Betamax overlap considerably. Out of necessity, the remainder of today's episode will mostly apply to both VHS and Betamax. Okay, let's roll on. While Cartravision was the first format to have pre-recorded media available for sale, or in the case of major movies, rental, the notion of pre-recorded home video really didn't come to fruition until the rise of Betamax and VHS. However, as of my making this, the history remains largely speculative. Here's my best stab at piecing this one together. I think we can safely say that the first pre-recorded VHS and Betamax tapes were bootlegs. And it appears that the first ones may very well have been adult films. Now, I've read anecdotally that the first movie officially released on VHS, Japan only, was the 1972 South Korean film The Young Teacher, issued in 1976. I have yet to find any proof of this tape's existence. Now, the first legitimately released Betamax tapes were released in the latter half of 1976. A few Russ Meyer movies and some assorted pornographic titles, only available through mail order at $300 a piece. Logic would dictate that VHS was added to the mix the following year, but I can't confirm that. On the bootleg front, there are a precious few, mostly Betamax, surviving copies of major mainstream films circulating around that date to 1977, like this rather ballsy copy of Fantasia. I've also read in the book From Betamax to Blockbuster that in 1977, some enterprising record store owners and music industry folks were impatient for officially released movies on VHS, or Beta for that matter, so they went the public domain route. However, the earliest public domain tapes I found come from Video or Sound Unlimited and The Nostalgia Merchant, which also licensed some films, but these date to 1978. So, by process of elimination, the earliest known, as of my making this, legitimate VHS releases come by way of Magnetic Video, which launched with a line of 50 pre-1973 20th Century Fox titles on November 17, 1977, all available on VHS and Beta, with titles starting at $50.
With Selectavision, you can go to the movies at your house.
Buy now during the RCA Film Festival and get 2 free movies and discount coupons for 5 more.
Convincing people to shell out a minimum of $50 per tape was not an easy one. As such, Magnetic Video tried 2 methods of gaining traction. One was a deal with RCA to throw in a Magnetic Video title with each Selectavision VCR sold. Later in 1978, this got bumped up to 2 free titles, plus a few coupons for discounts on more releases. Sony would not allow this kind of promotion with Betamax. Magnetic Video's other, more famous stab at establishing pre-recorded tapes is that, knowing there'd be initially very few brick-and-mortar stores to carry their tapes, they set about establishing a mail-order video sales club, namely the Video Club of America, which launched just in time for the 1977 Christmas season, advertising in the November 26th issue of TV Guide. It cost $10 to join and $49.95 per tape. One of the people that saw the TV Guide ad was one George Atkinson, who owned a mildly successful Super 8 film rental business in Los Angeles. In addition to film, Atkinson was already renting out U-matic duplicates of his public domain titles. Expanding into VHS and Betamax only seemed like the logical next step. However, Atkinson wound up bypassing magnetic video by way of a local electronics store that would sell him one copy apiece of each magnetic title on VHS and Beta for only $3 over wholesale. $3,000 later, Atkinson began renting them out. To stave off any losses, Atkinson made customers join his club for a $50 for a year or $100 one-time only fee, plus $10 a night per tape. While you'd think this wouldn't fare too well in 1977-78, it proved to be a goldmine. Sensing a good deal, similar stores sprang up in major cities across America, some requiring full-blown background checks before you could join the club. By 1979, Paramount Pictures sat up and took notice of the video club trend. Wanting to treat video rental like they would a film print of a movie, the company hooked up with Photomat, the once prominent photo developing kiosks. Providing Photomat with custom short-run VHS and Beta copies of selected titles, Photomat became the first significant video rental store, one that didn't require you to join a club. Rentals averaged around $12 for a 5-day period, a bargain for the time. By 1980, the selection expanded to include Disney and Warner Brothers titles. Around this time, the studios started allowing purchases of these tapes, starting at only $40, but usually wound up closer to $70. Having said that, there were 3 significant flaws in the Photomat plan. One, you had to call ahead for your video, which, assuming one was available nearby, would be ready for pickup the following day. Number 2, Photomat tapes were encoded with stop copy protection. In short, some of the levels on the tape were intentionally weak, causing some TVs and VCRs to lose grip on the vertical hold, causing a rolling picture. And number 3, video rental clubs weren't bound by individual studios. They could and did stock whatever they wanted. Photomat stopped renting tapes in 1982. VHS runs just a teeny bit deeper than you thought it would, doesn't it? So, by my estimation, it's gonna take 4, possibly 5 episodes to get through the history of VHS and its offshoots. And I don't know when I'm going to do Volume 2. I definitely don't want to do these all in a row. I think that would become just a bit deadening, both for me to make and for you to watch. So just know that I will get to it. But otherwise, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I'm confronted by some lunatic who is convinced that I'm a total idiot because he knows that he taped news coverage of the Cuban Missile Crisis on VHS in 1962.
No other video cassette recorder delivers more. RCA's Selectavision.
A new video cassette recorder with remote pause.
With 4-hour capability. And with a built-in timer.
And a camera.
What a rebate. What a deal. What a steal.
And welcome back to the mother of all archive history lessons. Yep, it's time for another installment of the history of VHS. And this time around, we're really going to start folding in more of the techie stuff. But I should note that you may very well notice that some fairly significant stuff does not get discussed here. And that's because I'm putting the cutoff date, unless contextually necessary, at 1988 today. And the reason it's 1988 is because that was the year that Sony, the purveyors of Betamax, finally broke down and started manufacturing VHS decks, and effectively ending the format war in the process. So if I don't mention things like ultra-long tapes or the quirky, short-lived VLP tape speed and some of that other stuff, it's just because we haven't gotten there yet. But anyway, the bulk of today's episode is going to be devoted to one last long and hopefully truly final look at the VHS Betamax format war. At least final here in archive land. And then the remainder of the episode will be devoted to the first offshoot of VHS, namely compact VHS, better known as VHS-C. So we've got plenty to talk about today, so let's get to it.
Boy, if you're a TV freak like I am, you're going to love what you're about to see. Let me demonstrate how Selectavision works.
Rather amusingly, the initial specs of both VHS and Betamax were dictated by some rather inflexible engineers for both products. It took the demands of consumers and marketing departments to drive most of the innovations. For starters, the first round of JVC VHS decks in late 1976, like the first Sony Betamax a year earlier, could only record at one speed. Having said that, during Betamax's development period, RCA got a glimpse of the prototype. Unimpressed by Beta's 1-hour recording time, an RCA representative inquired about a longer, slower playtime, like reel-to-reel audio tapes have. Sony responded that they felt it would eventually be possible, but would likely never be implemented, as the video quality would be unacceptable. When RCA hitched their wagon to the 2-hour VHS, they were met with the same response from JVC engineers. As such, RCA went to work on developing their own long play system, the idea being that a tape must be capable of recording an entire football game. When the first RCA VHS dropped in August of 1977, the long play option was included, allowing for up to 4 hours of record time.
Make that pledge. You'll feel better if you do. If you pledge $15, we can send you the story of the career of Betty Davis by Whitney Stein, accompanied by a running and witty narrative by Betty Davis.
Later in the year, Sony countered with the SL7200, which introduced their own half-speed recording option, as well as a bit of a rebranding. The original Betamax tapes were labeled as K30 and K60, representing the tape's potential record time, in minutes, obviously. The old K-series tapes were replaced with the more impressive-sounding L-series, L250 and L500, respectively replacing K30 and K60. 250 and 500 were the approximate length of tape in feet. To further compete with RCA, in late 1978, Sony introduced the L750, bumping potential record time up to 3 hours.
In the 61st Indianapolis 500, at this stage of the race, we now have 15 cars out of the race.
This new beta speed, known alternatively as X2 or B2, came at the cost of lowering Beta's 250 lines of horizontal resolution to only 240, making it effectively equivalent to standard mode VHS in the process. Wanting a leg up on VHS, in 1979, Sony introduced the SL5400, which introduced a 1/3 speed option, read X3 or B3, as well as the new L830 tape length, manufactured using thinner tape stock to make up for the lack of space in a beta cassette. These tapes were not recommended for use at B1 speed. Anyway, an L830 tape could record up to 5 hours in this new B3 mode, finally besting VHS, but only briefly. Not to be outdone, RCA went to work on their own 1/3 speed format. This became known as SLP mode, or super long play, which was introduced via the RCA Selectavision 600 in the fall of 1979. SLP, also known as EP, or extended play, allowed users to record up to 6 hours of material on a standard T120 cassette. In 1978, Sony introduced the first beta deck with stereo sound, but only on one of their industrial models, namely the SLO-323. While that was followed with a precious few Japan-only stereo machines, it took until 1982 for the first internationally released stereo consumer deck, the Marantz VR200, which also happened to be the only beta deck with Dolby C noise reduction. The first stereo VHS deck arrived sometime in the latter half of 1980 via the Akai VPS 7350, also known for being a rare key-lock unit. The first stereo home videotapes arrived in mid-1981 with the VHS issues of Michael Nesmith's Elephant Parts and Tom Jones' Live in Las Vegas, both equipped with Dolby no less. In 1982, MCA made stereo a requirement for all their VHS and beta releases, where possible at least. Dolby wasn't implemented until 1983. And speaking of hi-fi Luton audio,
sound has a look all its own, but it never looked like much on a home video cassette recorder.
In January of 1983, Sony announced the introduction of beta hi-fi sound. The first model, namely the SL5200, was released in June. Sony also created a short series of outboard hi-fi processors to hook to an existing machine. Beta Hi-Fi took the old best case frequency response of 50 to 10,000 Hz, not quite on par with a basic Type 1 audio cassette, and bumped it up to the near CD level spec of 20 to 20,000 Hz. Before the end of the summer, VHS retaliated with the JVC HRD725. While it and subsequent hi-fi decks matched Beta Hi-Fi's frequency response, it had a distinct disadvantage to Beta. Beta was able to use the existing video heads for recording and playback. VHS required an extra set of audio heads. Beta was also allocated 500 kHz for hi-fi audio, while VHS only got 150 kHz. Most commonly, VHS hi-fi was prone to interference and playback issues across multiple machines. That and extra wear and tear on your tapes.
Now, people are always asking me about the reindeer. Let me tell you a little story that happened last Christmas Eve. And that's one reason we're doing so much practicing this year.
By 1985, VHS was outselling Betamax by about a 5-to-1 ratio. In the name of gaining market share, spoiler alert, it didn't work. In January of that year, Sony announced the Super Beta pseudo format. The idea was that by upping the luminance carrier by 800 kHz and narrowing the gap between the VCR's heads and your tapes, they could squeeze in just over a 20% improvement in horizontal resolution. Read, you could now get 290 lines as opposed to only 240. In the bargain, the amount of degradation in signal in dubbed tapes was minimized. Because, of course, we all got to get our camcorder footage transferred and edited and not dub our rental movies, right? Anyway, this did come at a cost, both in price and quality. The initial line of Super Beta machines ran from $550 to $1,500. And despite claims to the contrary, Super Beta wasn't quite upward compatible with standard Betamax. The picture and sound quality were known to have a few artifacts on non-Beta Hi-Fi and/or Super Beta machines. Still acceptable, though. Later in the year, JVC introduced VHS HQ, high quality, which, while truly upward and downward compatible, not to mention most VHS decks made from about 1986 on have VHS HQ circuitry, the quality difference was negligible, getting you about a 3% improvement in signal-to-noise ratio. The best thing to come out of VHS HQ was that bright whites may look a hair smoother and less blown out. That's about it.
Just hold your head up high, and nothing is worth doing unless you do it right.
You can't buy Walter Payton's new record, but you can get it free with the purchase of a 3, 5, or 9-piece dinner.
Similar to Super Beta, in 1987, the Super VHS, or S-VHS, pseudo format was introduced. S-VHS easily jumped right past Super Beta in terms of quality, almost into Laserdisc territory, delivering up to 420 lines of horizontal resolution. Laserdisc could deliver up to 425. While S-VHS was backward compatible, it was not forward compatible. In other words, an S-VHS deck is 100% compatible with standard VHS, but S-VHS is not necessarily compatible with regular VHS decks. I mean, you can stick an S-VHS tape in any regular VHS deck and sustain no damage, but depending on your model, the material may or may not be watchable. It's kind of a crapshoot. Anyway, while S-VHS never sold too well, it did manage to become a favorite of prosumer users, often as a means of shooting, transferring, and editing camcorder footage. As for me, I use an S-VHS deck for general VHS transfers, just for that little extra bit of stability, thanks to the S-Video jack. As for the rest of the S-VHS saga, well, that's a story for Volume 3.
If you own a beta format VCR, you may have noticed that it's become increasingly difficult to buy or rent pre-recorded product on that format. The maker of the beta machine has noticed as well, and now Sony will market hardware in VHS for the first time.
While new Betamax decks were introduced in the US as late as 1993 and blank tapes were available as late as 2016, the format war really ended on Monday, January 11th, 1988, when Sony finally caved and announced it would manufacture its first VHS machines, or more accurately, rebrand some Hitachi VCRs. Sony didn't start manufacturing their own until late that year. Funnily enough, as little as 4 days before the big announcement, Sony, in an all-time great example of corporate spin, continued to deny the then ongoing rumors. Anyway, at the time, Beta's market share, depending on your source, was somewhere in the 9 to 12% range. By the time the last US Beta rolled off the line in 1994, the market share was down to 1%.
Of videotape recorder, we think that is our responsibility to meet with those diversifying demands of the customer.
6-hour Selectavision. Ah, the new video cassette recorder from RCA.
I've said it before, and I guess I'll say it again. The reason VHS won the format war was a perfect storm of greater accessibility, remember it was ostensibly an open format, usually lower prices, longer recording times, a greater willingness to shoot for user friendliness, and fewer necessary external toys. Not that Betamax was bad. If anything, it found itself at the technological vanguard more often than VHS, and at its best, was of somewhat better quality. And as much as I hate discussing it, I guess I'll mention the internet popular pornography theory one last time. While I certainly don't doubt that adult film at least helped a little with the adoption of home video, I've seen no evidence whatsoever that it held any sway over the VHS beta format war. Contrary to ever popular rumor, neither Sony nor JVC had any control over what was released on their respective formats. It was down to what the producers of such material chose to use. Get over it, Internet.
My new JVC compact VCR is the world's smallest, lightest VCR ever. It's ideal for taping graduation, school plays, Halloween.
While I can't find any concrete proof, the popularly known date for the introduction of VHS compact, or compact VHS, or VHS-C, is June 1st, 1982. And yes, like regular VHS, it was JVC that was behind this one. Anyway, the first VHS and Betamax camcorders started flying around in the late 70s. Given that all-in-one camcorders weren't quite a thing yet, they were all still large, heavy, two-piece portapacks at the time, JVC's idea was to, in the short term, come up with a lightweight alternative. As such, the first VHS-C camcorders brought the weight of the portable VCR, the part that did the recording, down to about 4 or 5 pounds, as opposed to the then common 20 or more. Now, I mentioned the short term. JVC had wanted to introduce an all-in-one camcorder, but couldn't quite pull it off yet. The release of VHS-C was hastened when Sony announced a forthcoming all-in-one standard Betamax camcorder. If nothing else, JVC got their smaller portapack out the door about a year before the Sony all-in-one camcorder. JVC got their first all-in-one out the door in 1984 with the GR-C1.
It began as an idea, a video camera and VHS recorder, all in one.
As always, JVC wanted their new product to be compatible with existing VHS. In this case, while there wasn't quite yet a means of popping your VHS-C tapes into your regular VHS deck, JVC made sure that these camcorders, both the portapack and the subsequent all-in-one, could be easily hooked up to just about any existing TV. To further ensure a foothold in the market, VHS-C was also notable for being the first camcorder to break the $500 mark, albeit only in basic fixed focus models. Amazingly, it took a few years, but around 1986-87, the VHS-C adapter finally hit the market, available in both motorized and manual models. I personally recommend the latter, finally allowing anybody to stick their VHS-C tapes into their regular VHS VCRs. However, I should note that these adapters put a little extra strain on the tape. Use the adapters responsibly.
Look what just popped up.
In 1985, Sony took another crack at the home video market with Video 8, which, while it did have some pre-recorded titles, it became obvious very quickly that it was really more of a camcorder format. Coupled with the threat of Sony's concurrent Super Beta, in early 1988, Panasonic, in tandem with JVC, same owners back then, decided to preempt the Super Beta camcorder with an equivalent compact version of the then new S-VHS. This was known as S-VHS-C.
We're shooting this with a JVC compact VHS camcorder. The gentleman we're watching is trying to play an 8mm camcorder tape on his VCR.
Once established, both VHS-C and S-VHS-C had a long, successful, and rather uneventful life. For the remainder of the existence of tape-based camcorders in general, it became less about new formats, though they certainly still happened, and more about refining existing technology. The formats themselves became almost secondary. The overall demise of VHS-C more or less coincided with the end of standard VHS in the late 2000s. Well, that's it for this installment of the world's longest VHS primer. Join us next time when, this being the archive, I probably do something that involves me leaning on even more VHS footage. It's a vicious cycle.
Testing. Testing.
And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that never lets a good opportunity go to waste. So today, let's resume our little ongoing history of VHS subseries. And I've noticed something. In all the reading I've been doing, digging around online, digging around YouTube, it appears that, as of my making this, nobody has ever attempted to cobble together a history of the Super VHS, or S-VHS, quasi format. So, opportunistic little monkey that I am, today let's devote this entire installment to just S-VHS. And believe it or not, there's quite a bit to talk about, so let's get to it. Before we begin, there are two terms that you're going to need to know for today's episode to make sense. If you're already familiar with this stuff, it'll only take a minute. Just bear with me. Anyway, with the context of today's episode in mind, luminance, or luma, or the Y carrier, the level of brightness, read black and white, in a signal. Chrominance, or chroma, or the C carrier, the level of color in a signal.
The Sony Super Beta Hi-Fi is the video cassette recorder that the experts say is 20% sharper than all others. For a limited time only, your Sony dealer has a 2-month subscription offer to First Choice Super Channel with your Sony Super Beta Hi-Fi.
As we discussed in Volume 2, in 1985, Sony attempted its latest one-up on JVC's VHS with Super Beta, which could deliver up to 290 lines of horizontal resolution, as opposed to the normal 240 for VHS and B2 and B3 Betamax. Super Beta marked the first real stab at raising the picture quality of an existing consumer video format. Given that the format wars were still in full swing in 1985, it should come as no surprise that JVC felt a need to retaliate.
When it comes to home computers, the Atari home computer gets high grades.
I use an Atari at home, and I use it for word processing and to teach myself other programming languages.
The impetus behind S-VHS largely stemmed from a fairly recent development in computer monitors and computer hookups. In 1979, the Atari 800 home computer adapted a system using a 5-pin DIN connector that used 2 of its pins to separate the Luma and Chroma signals. In 1986, Apple Computers introduced the Apple Desktop Bus, which used 4-pin mini DIN connectors to allow quick and easy hookup of keyboards and mice. Cobbling together Apple's favored connector and Atari's basic concept, JVC created S-Video. S-Video is kind of the walking, talking definition of an intermediate level video signal. On the one hand, you've got composite video, which mashes all the video signal into one element. On the other hand, you've got component video, which separates the chroma end of things down into 2 elements, in total 2 for chroma and 1 for luma. S-Video split the difference between component and composite with 2 pins of data devoted to chroma and 2 pins of data devoted to luma. This separate luma carrier, if you will, allowed for the amount of bandwidth to be raised and expanded, read higher and wider frequency, in turn allowing for a roughly 65% increase in image resolution. Having said that, the still combined chroma information didn't allow for any real improvement in color, keeping the chroma levels at only about 1/4 of broadcast TV. The advent of S-Video necessitated a change in videotape stock. To ensure that the greater luma demands could be fulfilled, S-VHS needed a tape stock with a more dense oxide coating. In the end, I guess you could kinda sorta liken the difference between standard VHS and S-VHS tape stock to the difference between ferric Type 1 and chrome Type 2 audio cassettes, the newer formula being more open to more data. Now the great question was, what practical use was there for S-VHS? As of 1987, broadcast TV in North America and Japan was only, at best, 330 lines of horizontal resolution, so a fair chunk of S-VHS's potential 400+ lines of resolution were wasted with off-air recordings, and broadcast TV's extra chroma information wasn't going to get captured anyway. Cable boxes and satellite receivers wouldn't start getting S-Video capability until the 90s. As of 1987, only a few monitors, as opposed to traditional TVs, were equipped with S-Video. Only a precious few high-end Mitsubishi TVs would start seeing S-Video capability in 1988, and S-Video wouldn't go mainstream on TVs until at least the mid-90s. The movie studios weren't interested in releasing anything on S-VHS. As far as they were concerned, Laserdisc was the videophile, video geek format. Professional users weren't gonna like the limited chroma information, which was weaker than Betacam, Betacam SP, and most, if you will, flavors of U-matic. But having said all that, there was one major plus to S-VHS. It was 100% backward compatible with standard VHS, both in playback and recording. Granted, it didn't make your standard VHS look much better, but at least you didn't have to worry about needing a second VCR. Regardless, JVC wasn't going to be able to market S-VHS on such a relatively small selling point, so the best they could do was wait for the camcorders, released in late 1987, and gun for the high-end home video and low-end production markets, and just hope for the best.
Can you tell us just the features? I'm buying one.
I can't find anything definitive, but it appears that JVC first announced Super VHS, or S-VHS, at the January 1987 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Regardless, true to form, this new pseudo-format was initially released only in Japan. In this case, in April of 1987, with the JVC HRS-7000. This VCR retailed for 220,000 yen, equivalent to over 263,000 yen, or nearly $2,500 in 2020. Here in the US, we were given the JVC HRS-7000U, which was introduced either in the late summer or early fall of 1987 and retailed for $1,200. Upon launch, 2-hour tapes retailed for around $20 each. Placing S-VHS further into the zone between home video and professional video, the HRS-7000 and variants was a bit of an odd duck. Having been released with really nothing to use it with, this unit hid its S-video input under a false faceplate. It also operated much more like an editing unit, with loads of picture and audio adjustments and potential editing markers built into a flap on the front of the machine. The second S-VHS deck, the HRS-8000, introduced in 1988, only somewhat streamlined things. Oh yeah, and added some wood paneling. Bizarrely enough, despite the unsurprisingly lukewarm reception to S-VHS, Sony felt the need to push itself and their Betamax into the picture one last time. Despite Sony's claims to the contrary, seemingly as if to simply prove that they could, within a few months of the Japanese introduction of S-VHS, Sony introduced its final consumer-y variant of their Betamax format, ED Beta, or Extended Definition Beta. Introduced in roughly October of 1987 in Japan and roughly June of 1988 in the US, ED Beta played by the same rules as S-VHS. It needed a richer tape stock, in this case metal oxide. You could also use Betacam SP tapes if you liked. The system took advantage of the S-Video standard, and it was 100% backward compatible with standard and Super Betamax. Unfortunately, it also shared the same lack of chroma information as S-VHS, and the price was well ahead of S-VHS. While the Japanese units sold for the same 220,000 yen as the S-VHS, by the time it landed in the US, the price started at a little below $2,000. Tapes retailed around $30 each. And the Sony EDC-55 camcorder sold for a staggering $7,700. Granted, Betacam SP camcorders started around $12,000 at the time. Also like S-VHS, ED Beta did some things almost too well for the time. The chief example being it's up to 500, or according to some sources, 550 lines of resolution. To put this in perspective, DVD would peak at equivalent to 410 lines, and PAL region Laserdisc peaked at 440 lines. Anyway, Sony backed itself into an even worse corner than JVC had with S-VHS. Even with a $1,500 to $2,000 camcorder, at least S-VHS was within the reach of wedding photographers and high school AV departments. ED Beta was simply too much for amateurs and too little for professionals. Well, sort of. ED Beta was discontinued in the US in 1990, but I have read anecdotally that ED Beta caught on as a professional format in the Middle East, lasting into the 2010s. Yes, a handful of movies found their way to S-VHS. In the end, probably somewhere between 100 and 150 of them. To the best of my research, all commercially available pre-recorded S-VHS tapes were made by the elusive Super Source Video, based out of San Francisco, California. The first titles were announced in the spring of 1988, the initial line consisting entirely of public domain titles and scenic videos with new age soundtracks. I can't find so much as a picture of a single one of these early tapes. Anyway, according to SuperSource president Hamilton Bryan, his vision was for SuperSource to be what Mobile Fidelity was to LPs and CDs, an upscale, higher fidelity alternative for the, in this case, videophile crowd. In 1989, SuperSource was able to secure the rights to a few major, mostly Paramount and Orion titles, most notably RoboCop, which you could pick up for a mere $89.95, or get for free with the purchase of a new Mitsubishi HS423UR S-VHS deck. To the best of my research, the last new S-VHS titles were released in 1992, with the last remaining stock cleared out in 1994. These days, if you can find a SuperSource title on Fleabay, be prepared to pay a pretty penny for it. In 1987, Sony introduced DAT, or digital audio tape. Problem was, like just about everything Sony did, it was 100% proprietary, and could only store 2 channels of audio. However, that same year, seeing the similarities between DAT and S-VHS tape stock, Alesis founder and resident inventor Keith Barr went to work on an expansion of / alternative to DAT. In 1991, Barr unveiled ADAT, or Alesis Digital Audio Tape, which began shipping in early 1992. ADAT was a digital audio recording system that allowed up to 8 tracks of audio on a normal S-VHS videotape. The unique thing about ADAT was that multiple machines could be linked and automatically synchronized, 16 machines to be exact, allowing for up to 128 track recording. In its day, ADAT was the perfect midway point between 4 and 8 track analog tape consoles and full-blown 24 to 48 track analog and digital consoles. The going rate of a 24 or more track digital console was north of $100,000 at the time. Meanwhile, each 8-track ADAT was only about $4,000. Granted, ADAT was incredibly touchy, and the slightest difference in calibration caused playback problems between different machines, but it worked well enough for the time. ADAT largely gave way to hard disk recording by the early 2000s. The dates get a little hazy here, but there were two major stabs at not necessarily making S-VHS better, but making it more accessible. No later than 1998, JVC unveiled both S-VHS-ET, expansion technology, and SQPB, Super VHS quasi-playback, both designed to expand at least some of the benefits of S-VHS to standard VHS machines and tapes. SQPB allowed S-VHS tapes to be played on equipped standard VHS decks. The great issue with SQPB was, while it did mean the difference between discernible video and a streaky earth-toned blob, the now discernible video was wobbly and soft-focused. But I guess it was better than nothing. I admit, I have to do some serious mental gymnastics to justify this one's existence.
Home-style chicken strips so delicious. The strips or the sauces? Big, all-white meat strips.
The more noteworthy crack at greater S-VHS accessibility was easily S-VHS-ET. Now, one of the great parlor tricks of the owners of the original 1987 to 97 S-VHS decks was trying to cut costs by drilling a hole in the appropriate spot of a standard grade standard VHS tape to fool their machines into thinking that they'd inserted a proper S-VHS tape. Never mind that the quality wouldn't be up to snuff with a real S-VHS tape. S-VHS-ET allowed users to record quote-unquote S-VHS on standard VHS tapes that would be compatible with all standard VHS decks. The quality is about halfway between standard and super VHS. And to briefly address an internet popular rumor about S-VHS-ET, the majority of these decks can record full S-VHS. They do not top out at S-VHS-ET. Turn the damn ET button off and check the menu for what signal is going into the inputs, and of course use a real S-VHS tape. Now, yes, there are some low-end models that top out at recording in ET mode, like the ones that don't have S-video inputs, but I think 90% of this rumor stems from good old user error.
But he was looked up, and 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 he was looked up.
I always like to give a definitive ending to my little history lessons, but despite my best efforts, I can't really do that this time. Unlike the end of standard VHS, there was no fanfare, no press, just a format that quietly faded away. Here's the best of what I've gathered. The last new model of S-VHS appears to be the JVC HR S9911 S-VHS-ET unit, which was introduced in 2002. The last JVC S-VHS decks probably rolled off the line at the end of 2005. The D-VHS format, which we'll tackle in Volume 4, was backward compatible with S-VHS and made as late as 2005 as well. As for the tapes, my best guess is they were discontinued around 2008, when JVC pulled the plug on all standalone VHS machines and most general support for VHS ended. This has got to be one of those ultra rare archive episodes where, dare I say, I have possibly walked away with a little less appreciation of the day's subject matter. I mean, prior to this episode, I really thought S-VHS was kind of cool. I mean, supposedly almost Laserdisc quality on almost normal VHS. But I think the real problem was that I just hadn't spent enough time with it. And I certainly got to spend my quality time with it making this episode. As you've seen, I have managed to cobble together some original S-VHS footage. But in dealing with it, I just couldn't escape feeling that it seemed a little unnatural, a little saturated, even by VHS standards. But I think I know why. Counterintuitive as it sounds, I think it's a weird little side effect of the extra luma. Or I'm just going completely crazy. But one thing I am sure of is that S-VHS really was just another one of those weird little offshoots of the whole VHS beta format war thing. It's just that for whatever reason, JVC decided to run with this one. The great occupational hazards of doing archive. But anyway, there is only one more chapter to go of this whole history of VHS thing. But in the name of my own sanity, I think I'm going to go back to doing some more standard archive stuff for a while, but we will finish this up at some point. But otherwise, that is it for today's archive. Join me next time when some hypersensitive former 1990s high school AV club geeks get together and have a little Oddity archive merchandise burning. All because of my preceding comments on S-VHS. Whatever, I mean, they've already paid for it. And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that gets derailed occasionally. Yeah, this episode was actually supposed to drop about 4 or 5 months ago now. But at the same time, I guess it's appropriate that I'm just getting around to it now because, for one, here we are at the end of another season. And it's appropriate because this just so happens to be the final installment of my little History of VHS subseries. Now, the whole reason that this got held up for so long was because I just wasn't finding a good method of capturing the footage for what is the heart of today's episode. Specifically, the short-lived, quirky D-VHS quasi-format. And this was especially a priority of mine because, as it turns out, like with the last installment when we did S-VHS, it looks like, as of my making this, nobody has attempted to piece together a history of the quasi format. So here I go again. Now, we also need to just wrap up the general saga of VHS, so we're also going to devote some time to those little oddball attempts at keeping the format relevant and the official end of the format, and we'll touch upon a certain revival of the format. Needless to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, so let's get to it. Digital video was inevitable. I mean, we'd already been writing computer programs to tape since the 50s. Incidentally, VHS was later used on some data backup systems. Anyway, digital video was first standardized in 1982, and the first proper digital video format arrived in 1986 with Sony's D1, or Digital One, which, in case the looks weren't obvious enough, was strictly intended for professionals. By 1994, this was joined by D2, D3 Digital Betacam, aka Digibeta, and D5, the latter being full-blown 1035 and 1080i interlaced high definition. In one last bit of rivalry with Sony, in 1995, JVC countered Sony's Digibeta with Digital S, later renamed D9. Digital S kept the same shell and half-inch tape size as VHS and S-VHS, although the tape stock formula was changed to a rich, high-density metal particle, or MP, formulation to accommodate the greater data needs. Digital S tape could also be used for
someday somebody's gonna make you wanna turn around and say goodbye.
Okay, let's jump back slightly here. In 1991, Japanese public TV network NHK officially regularly began broadcasts in the Muse High-Vision standard, an analog high-definition system which ran at 1035i, equivalent to 1,125 lines total. This was followed in 1994 by a line of Japan-only Muse Laserdiscs. So, of course, the logical progression would be the ability to record in that quality. And so, later in 1994, JVC introduced their latest VHS variant, WVHS, or wide VHS. This system allowed for full high-def broadcast quality recording via component video. Of course, if you so chose, you could still record at standard definition levels as well, or, somewhat tantalizingly, you could record the needed two, if you will, strips to accurately recreate standard definition 3D footage. I have no idea if anyone actually ever tried this, though. Despite no analog HD TV in North America, or Muse Laserdiscs for that matter, between November of 1995 and sometime in 1998, JVC did issue at least 2 WVHS units in the US, namely the SRW320U and the SRW7U. With the price tag of $9,850 for the 320, WVHS was clearly aimed at the professional market. JVC pulled the plug on WVHS later in 1998, and it probably had something to do with
Unlike the electromagnetic waves that your TV set is using now, digital TVs use ones and zeros, much like your computer or compact disc player.
Because of the sheer tonnage of necessary bandwidth, the FCC guaranteed that analog HD TV would never happen in the US. Instead, digital HD TV, as we know it, was born out of the FCC's demands regarding bandwidth use. It took a few years, but the ATSC, Advanced Television Systems Committee, did create and settle on a standard acceptable to the FCC. The ATSC 1.0 standard, as it became retroactively known, broadcast video in the MPEG-2 format and audio in the Dolby AC3, read Dolby Digital format. The first experimental digital HD broadcasts, again in the US, began in July of 1996. On October 29, 1998, digital HD TV went commercial with the broadcast of John Glenn's Return to Space. Now the question became how to facilitate off-air recordings of such things. Well, as it turned out, JVC didn't have to look too far because they could just carry over their digital S/WVHS tape stock to
VHS has evolved digitally. A high-definition video format that far surpasses standard TV images has now arrived.
Although JVC itself claims that D-VHS was introduced in 1999, the first D-VHS machine was actually introduced in September of 1997, namely the JVC HM DSR 100. This machine was designed to be used in tandem with JVC's then current line of Dish Network DSS mini satellite dishes. Soon thereafter, Hitachi introduced their VT-DX 815A, also to be used with DSS dishes. The catch was that given that different DSSs used different encoding, not to mention those pesky smart cards, tapes were all too often not interchangeable between machines. I guess you could look at these early D-VHS decks as the precursor to the hard disk-based digital video recorder, DVR. However, whereas you could get dozens of hours of potential record time on an early DVR, D-VHS at standard quality, at the time the only recording speed, could record equivalent to the model number of your tape. In other words, a DF420 tape could get you 420 minutes, or 7 hours, of record time. Getting back to DVRs, D-VHS developed a major problem very quickly, namely the introduction of the TiVo DVR on March 31st, 1999.
But News 13's Dave Malkoff was there for the grand kickoff, and he joins us live from the Convention Center with a tour of the show. Dave?
Well, Michael, this is the pinnacle of technology, CES 2001. There are so many cool gadgets.
At the January 2001 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, JVC announced the first fully independent D-VHS deck, but gave no real specifics, like a model number. At the same time, JVC announced that, with the cooperation of movie studios like Fox, Universal, and New Line Cinema, they would be introducing pre-recorded movies on D-VHS. This did come to pass, but with some revisions. The big one being that the movie studios were unhappy with the copy protection available on DVDs at the time. The studios wanted HDCP encryption on any released content. This was problematic because, at the time, only the unfinished JVC Dahlia HD TV could decode such a thing. When the Dahlia was introduced that summer, it cost a mere $13,000. JVC was ultimately able to handle HDCP decoding on the VCRs themselves. However, it forced pre-recorded major studio D-VHS to effectively become its own subformat. A subformat of a subformat when you think about it. This subformat was dubbed D-Theater. In the fall of 2001, JVC gave a soft launch of their HMDH30000U, ultimately the most common D-Theater unit, which retailed for just under $2,000. To add insult to injury, at the time, there was no software to go with it. It took until June of 2002 for the first D-Theater tapes to drop, and even then were only available at Good Guys stores, which only existed in California, Oregon, Washington State, and Nevada. Or you could hit up dvhsmovie.com. Regardless, at the time of launch, a whopping 4 titles were available, one apiece from 4 distributors, and retailed from $35 to $45 each, about on par with a high-end DVD. Think something like the Criterion Collection. However, unlike DVD, things like special features were virtually non-existent. By the end of D-Theater's run, you might get something like a second DTS-encoded soundtrack, but that was about it. And only the final D-Theater units, like the JVC HMDH5U, supported it. It took until the launch of D-Theater to finally standardize the recording end of D-VHS. By the time all was said and done, blank D-VHS tapes sold for between $10 and $15 each, the longest tape being the DF480, which could record up to 50 gigabytes of data at up to 4 recording speeds. This worked out to, in high definition, 4 hours at HS, or high speed, this was full-blown proper 1080i, 8 hours at STD, or standard speed, in standard definition 24 hours at LS3, or low speed 3, and 40 hours at LS5, or low speed 5. In addition, all D-VHS units, D-Theater or not, were not only backward compatible with S-VHS and standard VHS, but could record in S-VHS, S-VHS-ET, and standard VHS.
In audio and video, digital signal processing plays an important role in providing far better sound and picture quality.
For all of D-VHS's strengths, there were still quite a few drawbacks, some pretty damning. First, high-def recording was only possible via 4-pin FireWire, so unless your TV tuner or cable box had a FireWire port, which never really caught on, you were stuck with VHS and S-VHS. Speaking of FireWire, second point, on some machines, true high-def playback was only possible via FireWire. Only the higher-end JVC D-Theater units could output component or HDMI. Third, the rich metal particle tape put considerably more wear and tear on the VCR's main head drum. Someone who regularly recorded and played D-VHS tapes could burn out a drum within a couple of years. Fourth, while it's kind of a necessity at this point, for the few that still own one of these things, the manual strongly discourages manual cleaning of the tape path, necessitating some costly, and at this point rare and well past their shelf life, cleaning tapes. Fifth, tape is still tape, and with such large amounts of data, the slightest bit of damage and or moderate wear to a tape will cause the VCR to temporarily choke on the content. And lastly, by this point, JVC's heart just didn't seem to be in VHS anymore. The quality of most of their D-VHS units is mediocre. The noisy tacked-on fan on the back is a nice touch. Oh yeah, and the survival rate of these machines isn't too hot. There's a fair amount of period documentation describing the lack of compatibility from one machine to another, particularly between JVC and Mitsubishi machines. As someone who's got one of each, plus an old Digital 8 camcorder, let's put this claim to the test.
I really need to do something about the leaves. Get a good bright sunshiny shot here.
The last movie to come out on D Theater was the 2004 film I, Robot, which saw a very limited tape release in 2005. To the best of my research, only about 80 D Theater titles and a handful of standard pre-recorded D-VHS tapes, all from the original HDNet cable channel, were ever released. Now, officially, 2007 was the year that JVC and Mitsubishi discontinued D-VHS VCRs. Hitachi had long since bailed by then. Having said that, I have found no evidence that any new VCRs were manufactured after the end of 2005. I'm guessing it just took a while to unload the old stock. Of course, the end of D-VHS is no great shock. DVRs were on the market as early as 1999, and standalone DVD recorders were available as early as the early 2000s, or 1999 in Japan. None of which required any special equipment. As for D Theater, HD DVD and Blu-ray both debuted in 2006, rendering it completely irrelevant.
Circuit City has guaranteed low prices on the top brand names you want and friendly advice to answer all your questions.
I was a bit of a budding home video geek during the late 90s and early 2000s, and I have absolutely zero recollection of D-VHS. And I spent a lot of time at Best Buy, Circuit City, and Soundtrack back then. Hell, my parents bought one of those DSS dishes in 1999. I remember being with them in the showroom and all, and I never saw a single VCR in there, and I think I would have noticed. So I can only guess that D-VHS saw very little promotion. And I'm not surprised. As a recording device, it was a stopgap between VHS and DVRs. As a playback device, there just wasn't much HD content out there at the time, nor were there many HD TVs. By the time HD TV saw wide adoption in the mid to late 2000s, DVRs were the norm for recording, and Blu-ray was the norm for pre-recorded high-def material. And in my experience working with D-VHS for this episode, it's a maddeningly idiosyncratic and at times unreliable format, to the point where I'd much rather deal with standard VHS. I think we can safely say that VHS largely existed on its own ubiquity during the 2000s. Nonetheless, there were some miscellaneous developments, none of which really did anything to extend its shelf life. The most noteworthy of these developments was ever greater potential record time. In no later than 1997, JVC and Memorex introduced blank T160 and T200 tapes, respectively reaching up to 8 and 10 hours of potential record time in EP, extended play mode. Some DVHS tapes, namely the JVC DF420 and DF480, were equivalent to T210 and T240, respectively 10.5 hours and 12 hours in EP mode. Having said that, to the best of my research, standard tape stock T210s and 240s were only released in Japan and South Korea. Anyway, the trade-off was that, as we already learned with Betamax, The more tape, the thinner it's going to have to be to fit in the cassette, and by turn, that much less robust. In 2003, Panasonic introduced the SA-HT820V DVD-VHS combo unit. This machine is noteworthy because it could record in the VP, very long play, speed, which ran at 1/5 the speed of SP, standard play mode. As such, with a handy-dandy T240 or DF480 DVHS tape, you could officially record a whopping 20 hours of material. Speaking of ultra-slow speed recording, if you're completely insane, you could use a time-lapse VHS deck, for security systems, and get video and audio down to 1/9 of SP mode. As such, you could, with a T240 tape, record up to 36 hours. The quality is going to be absolutely miserable, but it can be done. Anything less, and there'll be no audio, and soon thereafter, only still frames. On October 27, 2008, JVC announced it had manufactured its final standalone VHS machine, and as far as I know, the last one, period. Only 4 more days and it would have been a perfect 32 years. Anyway, at the same time, Distribution Video Audio Incorporated, a small Burbank, California company which stocked Family Dollar stores and a few others, shipped the final truckload of pre-recorded VHS tapes. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturer Funai continued to churn out cheap VHS DVD combo decks, but threw in the towel in July of 2016. Not necessarily due to lack of sales, though. They were still selling around 750,000 units a year. But instead, it was due to lack of parts. It shouldn't shock anyone when I say that VHS has never really gone away. Hell, as of my making this, blank tapes are still being made for bulk purchases. New S-VHS tapes are still around if you know where to look. VHS head cleaning tapes, not recommended, are still available at mainstream outlets like Walmart and Amazon. Once in a while, movies are still released on VHS, be it as a promotional item or a short-run collector's item. I purchased one of a short-run reissue just last year. This very show has had short-run VHS releases. Then there's the fact that many films that were once on VHS have never found their way into the digital domain. Yale University has got a running archive of never reissued VHS titles, many of unknown legal, in the copyright sense, status. All too often, these days when we think of VHS, we think of a certain hipster stereotype. Now, while I don't foresee VHS ever having quite the resurgence that, say, vinyl records have, I do hold out hope for some new higher-end tape decks. We've still got good new turntables and film projectors. Anyway, over the last few years, it's largely been the horror community that's really brought back VHS. How apt. It doesn't explain the absolutely insane prices some folks have paid in recent years for old tapes, though. Another, less surprising piece of the VHS renaissance has come from the art community, particularly the art pop world. Just as the original purveyors of video art during the 60s and 70s were interested in exploiting the shortcomings of videotape for effect, think video feedback, subsequent generations have been interested in exploiting the hazy, undefined video quality of VHS, the glitches that occur when a tape is worn out, damaged, or copied too many times, and all those other uncanny, unrepeatable, After Effects, analog-isms. It's taken me about 1.5 years to get through this little sub-series, and I still wouldn't quite call it definitive. And that's really because VHS was such a huge format and just such a sprawling concept in general that to get through all the history and the technical stuff and to take a look at the social impact that it had, which I barely touched on, I would guess that it would take a solid 500-page book to do it justice. But having said that, that wasn't the goal of this little undertaking of mine to be definitive. What I wanted to do here was give just a good overview, so not too shallow, but not too bogged down in details either. So I, like many others, continue to await the definitive tome on the subject. But anyway, that is it for today's archive. Join me next time when, after a little pseudo-sabbatical, I once again dive into the great audiovisual landfill.